So it looks like we are recording, which is good. So we should be recording. So Philip, Chris, Dave, Gareth, if everybody's happy to be recorded, that's good. We've
Yeah.
got the recording working, I think, which is excellent. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's Coffee Morning. We're delighted to have David Robbins join us from Willis Towers Watson. Absolutely delighted to have him on board. And today we'll be talking about well, it's headline post-budget blues. Whether we've got the blues or not about the budget, we don't know. And also Buy British and the British ISA, I'm sure, will be discussed at some point. As usual, if you'd like to make a point, put it in the chat. Or indeed, if you'd like to actually ask a question or make a statement and challenge anything the government's doing, then raise a hand. Henry's going to be running the show, so I will now pass over to Henry and enjoy the session. And thanks for everyone for attending.
Yeah, it's great to see you, David, and it's nice to see you. I think the beard is actually a great addition. I'm sorry we gave an earlier version of you on the slides, but definitely the best beard in pensions right now.
Yeah, it's a bit. I'd quite like to get rid of it, but my daughter was born when I had a beard and has only ever known me with a beard. And whenever I suggest to her that I might get rid of it, she's horrified by the idea. So it's got to stay for the time being.
Until she grows up. So you've got about 14, 15 years with you there. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, that's about as long as I suspect the Labour Party will stay in power unless the Conservatives actually pull their socks up. But that's a political statement from me, and it is not endorsed by anyone else in the room. So shut up, Henry. And over to you, David. Well, I'd be interested to know what you made of the budget overall. Just a sort of high-level view. How did you feel it went? Was it?
I mean, I think from a pensions perspective, it certainly wasn't the budget from 10 years ago when George Osborne did pension freedom. It wasn't even the budget from 1 year ago in terms of significance when Jeremy Hunt abolished the lifetime allowance, or never mind, with you and the National Liberal Club today, Henry, the People's Budget of 1906. So I mean, from a pensions point of view, it was quiet, and I'll always take that. I mean, I think I'm one of those people. If you think back to immediately after the Brexit referendum, some people on the Remain side were saying one of the things which is terrible about Brexit is that Parliament is now going to be really distracted by this and won't have time to do all of the kind of exciting things in pensions policy and other areas that it might have done. And I thought, well, that could actually be a positive, because I'm kind of someone who's always a bit more fearful of a flurry of policy initiatives making things worse, but I am hopeful that they'll make things better. So I'll always take a quiet budget, and I think this is just about as quiet a budget for pensions as I can remember. I think certainly my leaving the office time was about as early as I can remember on a budget day. I mean, I guess more widely, he had a bit of a sticky wicket. You've got his party 20 odd points behind in the polls. There's this kind of unresolved tension in the Conservative Party, even after the Truss government blew up, between those who believe in kind of Laffer curve tax cuts, let's just cut taxes, and those who favour fiscal responsibility. The Chancellor was walking a bit of a tightrope between those two, and he managed to stick to his slightly suspect fiscal rule whilst giving a tax cut which was just about big enough to satisfy those who were clamouring for it. And I think he was probably one of the things we'll come on to talk about is the national insurance cut. And you could see the kind of internal politics of making a virtue out of necessity there. So he had limited headroom to cut taxes or increase spending whilst keeping to his rule about national debt falling at the end of in the final year of the forecast period. An income tax cut, which Rishi Sunak favoured when he was Chancellor, was looking a bit too expensive. Certainly, if they wanted to do 2p, so I think he made a virtue out of a necessity, and he said national insurance is this tax on work, and it's terrible that people pay more tax on earned income than on non-earned income. And then brief for the the headlines a day or two later about wanting to spell the end of national insurance, which I think means only employee national insurance and possibly only the main rate. But it gives this sort of headline with no timetable attached to it, no costing attached to it. But the 50 billion or so cost of abolishing the main rate of employee NI, whilst unaffordable, isn't as crazily unaffordable as doing something big on income tax. So it's kind of like close enough to being credible as a long-term ambition that he could get some sort of headline out of it. So I think he navigated that. He'll probably be quite pleased with the way that he navigated that. On pensions, I think you've got a mixture of things which are tangentially relevant, so national insurance and the child benefit, high income charge taper changes. Both of those will affect the numbers in terms of the attraction of paying higher pension contributions for particular groups of people. Lower rates of employee NI make salary sacrificed employer pension contributions a bit less attractive than they were. I guess with the question, if that were to keep going down, do you get to a point where some employers who currently don't share their own national insurance saving with the employee, because the employee is getting a decent saving themselves, might have to think again about that? I mean, possibly not. I mean, there are people earning over the upper earnings limit. We're only paying 2% employee NI now, but I mean, maybe some of those employers where you've got a large workforce earning under 50,000 and are currently getting a fairly chunky employee NI saving on salary sacrifice contributions, that's already gone down from 12% to 10% to 8%, and may go lower in future if he gets the chance.
There are some consultancies whose entire business model is built around national insurance and salary sacrifice. So I mean, there are implications on both the employer side and the consultancy side for, especially if the Chancellor sees a way to cut national insurance to zero. One of my questions to you was, do you think that there is something deeply embedded inside the Treasury which says this is something which we want to do? We've made our mind up, we want to get rid of national insurance, or is this a conservative ideological thing?
I think neither, actually. I think so. I mean, it was only not very many years ago, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, and they were talking about increasing national insurance and badging it. We're going to rebudget the health and social care levy. Going back to the Blair Brown government, when they needed to raise taxes on income, their preferred way of doing it was national insurance. I think there's long been a consensus in politics that increases in national insurance are more politically palatable than increases in income tax, partly because people don't understand it, partly because it sounds like you're contributing to something and paying for something nice, and it's maybe slightly easier to make kind of hypothecation argument if you want to spend it on something worthy in the kind of social services space. And so that's been a feature of British politics and Treasury thinking for quite a long time. It could easily come back, and even with the Conservatives reading the Hansard of the budget debate, Cyrilla Braverman, former Home Secretary, who would be kind of like on the list of people who fancy themselves as a potential future Conservative leader, her contribution to the debate said, I regret that the Chancellor's chosen to cut national insurance rather than income tax because this doesn't help pensioners and so on. So I don't think there's a strong commitment to it there. What I think it was is he hadn't got the headroom, and he thought, well, okay, if I've got to do national insurance, let's see how we can make a good argument for it.
Okay,
part of this is genuine supply side stuff about the labour market. There's also, I think, an appeal to him for Scotland, because if he does anything on income tax, it doesn't affect what goes on in Scotland. If he does national insurance, it does. So he can kind of play the unionist card there, especially when he's upsetting the Scottish Tories by doing some of the oil and gas stuff.
It's interesting that the hypothecation of national insurance is in two directions, one to the NHS and the second to the state pension. I haven't heard anyone picking up on this. Do you think that hypothecation in that sense is dead? I'm sorry we haven't got Andrew Young on the call, actually, because he's usually very good on this sort of thing. But his view generally is that the national insurance, there is still some kind of fund there, which is notional, but which does actually give us some greater security with regard to the future payment of state pension. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, David.
Well, I mean, something which Andy would know a lot more than me. So it's a shame he's not here. But I mean, I think. Well,
where are you, Andy Young?
I think hypothecation generally, it's always a little bit of a fiction because money is fungible, and you can if you're allocating this, if you put up national insurance by 1% and say we'll spend that on the NHS, then that bit of the NHS budget you don't need to find from somewhere else. So it's and of course you get into but particularly the health service. I mean, if you're saying right, this money from national insurance is going into the health service, do you then say, if the economy takes a bit of a hit, more people are out of work, wages are falling, and national insurance revenues are lower, that the NHS budget should fall proportionately? I don't think any of the politicians who favour hypothecated NI rises for the NHS have advocated that. In terms of the state pension bit, and I think, I haven't claimed any expertise on the mechanics, but I think the money, but the bit that goes to the NHS kind of gets siphoned off before going into the National Insurance Fund, and the money that makes it into the National Insurance Fund is for contributory social security benefits, of which well over 90% is state pension, in terms of current expenditure. I mean, I guess you've got a situation that the government actuary does a review every 5 years. His latest set of projections, well, it would now be her latest set of projections.
It's her.
It's her. Except the report was done a couple of years ago, so I think Martin Clark was probably still the government actuary when the report was done. But the latest set of projections show the kind of required treasury, so the shortfall between the money that you're getting in from national insurance and what you're paying out in state pensions and other contributory benefits. Current legislation allows the treasury to top that up, but by a maximum of 17% of a benefit outgo, and I think the projections show you hit a bit of a wall with that by sometime in the 2060s, and of course those projections were done before the latest NI cuts, so that date will inevitably be earlier when it's next updated. Does that matter? Well, I mean, they can change the legislation to allow a bigger treasury grant, or they could, do bigger structural things where you get rid of the concept of a separate national insurance fund and it all comes out of a consolidated fund. So I mean, it doesn't matter from the perspective that they can find a way to finance state pensions, even if national insurance revenues are drying up. It might matter though, in that it influences the debate over state pension changes. So you could envisage a government that wanted to raise the state pension age, saying one reason why the state pension in its current format isn't sustainable is that the National Insurance Fund is getting into deficit earlier. Or you could envisage a government that wanted to drop the triple lock, and I've always thought if the triple lock is going to be dropped, it's probably most likely to happen shortly after an election. So you'd get a party that was elected on a promise to keep it, saying, yeah, we promise to keep it, we will indeed keep it for the next 5 years, but we're going to start budgeting on the basis that we switch to something else after those 5 years are up. And so you could see the national insurance numbers being used to feed into that sort of debate. Just as if you go back to when the coalition government made big changes to pension arrangements for public sector employees, a slightly farcical argument that Nick Clegg made at the time was the kind of cash flow balance between contributions going in and benefits going out. The difference between two very big numbers is about to get worse, which was not really a reason to change anything, because that was entirely a function of decisions which have been made in the past, and a big bulge of people coming up to retirement age. But numbers that can be used to justify change will be used to justify change.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the things that everyone got quite excited about on the Saturday before were the announcements made by the Chancellor that he was going to introduce a more stringent value for money measure, which could lead to certain pension schemes closing down in due course if they couldn't prove they were providing value for money, and also that pension schemes would have to declare their allocation to UK equities and be presumably named and shamed if they didn't sufficiently invest in UK equities. What's your thinking about that, David?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an investment specialist, but I mean, so my understanding of the announcement is it's concerned with defined contribution schemes, and I think currently there are rules for trust-based DC schemes, excluding the small kind of small self-administered schemes, where you have to disclose your investments and break them down into 8 asset categories. Those 8 categories don't include, for equities, a breakdown between UK and overseas, but there's statutory guidance which strongly encourages schemes to do that. I think that's disclosed through the chair's statement. I'm actually not sure whether there's any work program underway of TPR preparing to analyse these disclosures in chair statements as they come in, which I think would be quite an interesting piece of data for this debate. But that's in the trust-based space, so you have to provide this asset allocation. You don't have to provide a geographical breakdown, but you're strongly encouraged to. I think the government had already suggested, as part of a value for money agenda, that they wanted to kind of map something similar across to the contract-based space. And so I think the change is saying that yes, there will be this kind of mandatory UK, non-UK breakdown within that. What's driving it? I mean, I think the debate's a little bit confused as to what exactly the government wants to achieve, and this, it's all the parallels here of the whole Brit ISA thing, which we might come on to. In the Jeremy Hunt's comment in the Treasury's press release announcing this, said, UK pension funds don't contribute as much to the UK economy as some overseas funds do to their economies, because they're not investing as much in British businesses. So it is, if the idea is that you want money going into British businesses, does that mean businesses which are listed in the UK, which seems to be the intention of listed equities, or businesses which are actually investing in capital projects in the UK, employing people in the UK, and so on, which might be quite different? And you think there are FTSE 350 firms which are investment trusts and themselves invest in global equities. There are FTSE 350 firms which are miners and may employ a handful of people in an office in the UK, and all of their substantive operations are done overseas. So it's whether helping the UK economy means providing capital for UK economic activity, or whether it's what I think an FT piece referred to as a piece of industrial policy to help the stock exchange as a listing venue. And there are arguments as to why the government might want to do either of those, but I think the relative importance of those objectives could be articulated a little bit better.
Like Baroness Altman's been very strong, and she said, you know, the UK taxpayer is paying for a large amount of the money which is currently in going into pensions, and they deserve to have a little bit more of the action than they're getting at the moment by way of investments. So that's a fairly, well, you might say it's almost jingoistic argument for investments, but it's got sort of populist appeal, and keep our pensions British.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a slightly different argument here for pensions and ISAs. So, I mean, ISAs, you could argue that the tax treatment is broadly neutral, and that not taxing investment returns on ISAs just kind of makes the decision between saving and immediate consumption more neutral. Pensions generally are tax favoured, and so you, albeit not to nearly the extent of Ros's numbers imply, because I mean she's looking at the kind of gross contributions, she's including, you know, national insurance relief on for public sector employers, she's including not taxing members of DB schemes on deficit contributions. She's using gross numbers rather than net numbers. So there's a lot of reasons why her numbers overstate it, but her basic point that there is some kind of tax privilege for pension saving, you know, is correct, and you can see, you know, why the government might make that sort of argument. I mean, I suppose, again, I'm not an investment person, but I suppose from an investment point of view, fiduciaries want the best returns for the level of risk that they can get, and there's been some slightly confused, I suspect slightly confused numbers floating about. There's Simon French from Pamela Gordon, I think, and an economist has been highlighting some numbers the Capital Markets Industry Task Force put out at the time of the autumn statement, which have gathered lots of attention from some of the more thoughtful Conservative MPs and commentators.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It might be useful to have a show of hands, actually, at this stage. How many people on this call, we've got about 18 of us, are pro the idea of a greater allocation to UK equities, even if it might lead to lower outcomes in terms of DC savers and potential funding problems regards to DB schemes? Vote now. Raise your hand if you're one of those people who thinks it's a good idea. Good. You can do it electronically. Right. Now, just to see how many people are actually on the call rather than just talking, how many people, put your hands down if you put your hands up digitally. Henry. Yep, well done. Now, those who think it's a bad idea to make people's pots or to increase their allocation to UK equities. Okay. So, I mean, it looks like there's quite a strong number, 8 of us against it, including a member of the House of Lords.
10 now.
10, yes. Okay. All right. So that doesn't look to me to be like the most popular within the pension environment. It would just be interesting if we did that same poll for a random of people off the street, whether they would feel the same way, whether they'd be voting with Miss.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Mrs. Altman. Yeah,
I think one. I mean, a couple of reasons why it might be thought of a bad idea, and people who just stick their hands up can add their own. But I mean, one is we're already exposed quite enough to the UK economy. It's a bit like the argument for employee share ownership, where you say, oh, if people had shares in their employers, they'd work a lot harder and all the rest of it. But you think, well, people are already quite exposed to their employers' performance in terms of keeping their job and pay rises and so on. And it's a bit like that with the UK economy. If the UK economy does well, we all benefit in various ways, and investing overseas is maybe a bit of a hedge against potential futures in which case the UK economy does less well. And indeed, you know, I'm sure people could produce recent numbers where investing, you know, being overweight UK has not been a good investment strategy.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can see the numbers. It clearly isn't if you're using listed UK equities, although it might be a different matter with private equities, which are a different thing altogether. And some of the numbers on UK equities are kind of really very odd indeed, aren't they? Because of course they aren't UK equities at all, and the whole FTSE 250 investment trust thing is a bit of a nonsense because of the massive discounting going on at the moment, because of the weird disclosures which are having to go on those funds, which are reducing allocations to them from pension schemes, etc. So I've got a couple of hands up. I'm not sure if that's a legacy of having the hands up, but I'll ask anyway. Gareth, have you got a question, or is that just a legacy of having your hand up? Gareth?
It's a legacy. I thought I'd taken my hand down.
Okay, you hadn't. Okay, well, Chris,
trying it again.
Chris Giles, are you wanting to speak
right,
or ask a question?
Yes, Henry, I thought I'd just clarify why I put my hand up. I think you know, and some of the people on this call will know from my previous blogs, that I've got to focus on those over 50 who I believe should be continuing to invest in equities. And the reason I believe they should be continuing to invest in equities as they near retirement is the fact that they should be concentrating on generating income. And of course, the UK is one of the highest yielding markets in the developed world. And that's influencing slightly my view. I'm not arguing so strongly for those in the accumulation stage.
It's not an often stated fact, but you're right. UK equities do produce a lot of dividends. Great stuff.
And Henry, it's very interesting given the government's stance. What's the other major, shall we say, developed market, perhaps not a major market, of course, is Australia, which also is a high yielding equity market.
Okay, that is also very interesting. But we are getting a little bit away from the budget, so we'll get back to the budget now, David.
I guess. Sorry, just before your next question. The thing with these two parts of the announcement from Saturday before the budget linked together, so the potentially shut down pension schemes if they're not performing, and greater disclosure of UK equities with an agenda of increasing investment in UK equities, is how you select those benchmarks to determine how well you're performing. And obviously Australia's got its own system of what the benchmark asset allocation that you're measuring yourself against is, but it's you could imagine some potential benchmarks in which those schemes who have been overweight UK equities over the past however many years would have then failed the performance test and have to be shut down, which is not presumably what they.
Yeah, that would be ironic, wouldn't it? We did what we were told, and now you're shutting us down because we invested in UK equities. Yeah, hard luck. Yeah, so moving on. There was a lot of fuss, and not really so much fuss in the sort of DB world, but in the DC world about this pot for life idea, which the government seemed rather more keen on than perhaps people thought. Have you got any feelings about that, David? Do you think this pot for life thing is a goer? Do you think it will translate into another government, whether it be of the blue or red, or should I say orange hue, also the National Liberal Club?
I think, the development of the budget was that they sounded a bit less kind of gung-ho about it than they had done at the autumn statement. The autumn statement, the consultation paper is quite interesting in that it doesn't consult on whether they should do it, it consults on how they should do it. And within that how, there are lots of questions. Is the employer still choosing a scheme for people who haven't been stapled to one, or do they get carouselled, or do you have a transitional mechanism where things proceed as now, but there's some employee choice window before you get automatically enrolled, which would require quite a lot of changes to automatic enrolment processes. I think in terms of whether it goes ahead, the language now is a bit more kind of exploring whether to do it rather than just exploring how to do it. I suspect, if the Conservatives were to stay in power forever, then I suspect that sooner or later something like this would happen, because there's for a long time been a strand within Conservative thought about, giving letting individuals choose. In the pension space, you could go right back to a kind of early 1980s pamphlets from the Centre for Policy Studies, which gave rise to personal pensions and people, the whole kind of break the chains of your employer's occupational scheme agenda. And it was for years and years has been Conservative MPs suggesting things like this, Conservative think tanks suggesting things like this. So, you think sooner or later someone would want to pick up and run with it. Although precisely when comes down to how much disruption they're proposed to inflict on employers, when they've got other priorities. In terms of Labour, I mean, I was slightly surprised. I don't know if anyone's listened to Tom McPhail's podcast following the budget.
Langcat one,
yeah. Where so he did one with Tom Selby from AJ Bell, just wrapping up what they thought of the budget. And Tom McPhail mentioned in passing that he had spoken to Jill Furness, Labour Shadow Pensions Minister, and asked her what she thought of it, and he was surprised that she sounded quite enthusiastic. Now, I was a bit surprised by that. I thought Labour might be a bit more hostile to this, especially as I think trade unions generally aren't that keen on the idea. But I probably wouldn't overstate that. I mean, as Tom said on his podcast, the ultimate decision would be taken higher up, and it's not necessarily that certain which you would get the pensions minister job if they were elected anyway. So
my next meeting, David, is actually over at some social market foundation place with Jill Furness and Tom McPhail and Michael Johnson on this very subject. So
really, okay.
I'll when I report on this excellent session, I will also, as far as I can do, report on that, although it's under the hideous Chatham House rules, so you won't get who said what, but you will get the general tenor of things. And we'll see whether Jill's as good as her word on Tom's. Well, as she wasn't speaking on Tom's podcast, she was being reported on Tom's podcast. Would be, yeah. Okay, so
I think just briefly on Pot for Life. I mean, it's a rehearsal all of the arguments. I mean, I think as someone who's quite hostile to this, I would accept there is an obvious argument in favour of it, which is that you get, not just with small parts, but with multiple parts, you get a duplication of administration costs. It's harder for people to manage their pensions. I bet dashboards will help with the second problem. And I think that the policy challenge is how you weigh that against the potential detriment from going to that model. And for me, the kind of the big potential detriment is one, marketing costs, where you could see a lot of money being spent on TV, on tube adverts and whatever, and that ultimately being passed on to savers through the charges they pay, or two, just a bit of a philosophical point, but whether employers or employees are kind of more likely to keep providers honest when it comes to charges start creeping up and you say, oh, my charges has gone up by 0.1%, but I don't understand, it looks quite small and I don't understand that number, and it's not going to affect me for decades, so am I going to take any action now to do anything about it? And
I think that people might get quite upset at the thought of being carouselled, a phrase which I've not heard before. I think if Martin Lewis came up with that and said, you're in danger of being carouselled, I should think about 6.5 million viewers would immediately take cover. So yes, let's see how that goes. And I will report more on it. There was something finally which you put on one of your tweets, David, which I've reported on, but I thought was very noble of you. You went through all the background statements, and you couldn't find in the budget forecasts any notice whatsoever that the government was intending to introduce the AE reforms of 2017. I just wondered if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so this is. I mean, I think, background for this, you think about when automatic enrolment originally came in, I think it could be a case study for, civil servants joining the Treasury, just kind of fast stream graduates in terms of how you slow something down. You think that the Pensions Commission was created December 2002, and it was April 2019 before minimum contribution rates were fully phased in. And okay, you had a a financial crisis and all the rest of it, and reasons to be, some good reasons to take things slowly. But I think it's a bit like the analogy I draw is with the Elizabeth line, or what used to be called Crossrail. Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, it's got a very good book out, and one of the things he says in there is when he was working as a Treasury official in 2007 or thereabouts, when the government gave the go-ahead for Crossrail and committed all of this money, Treasury officials were told, well, okay, this looks like a bit of a blow from a public finances perspective, but we should take this as a win because you managed to delay it for 20 years. And so, as a Treasury official, give ourselves a pat on the back over that. And I think I think that's very similar to the approach of how automatic enrolment was rolled out, and that the Treasury is now repeating that trick with the 2017 changes. So in 2017, you had the review, ironically entitled "Automatic Enrolment: Maintaining the Momentum," and there's not been all that much momentum maintained. Where they said that their ambition from the mid 2020s was to make everyone pay pension contributions from first pound of income, get 18 to 21-year-olds enrolled. But this was some classic language in there about this being subject to finding ways to make it affordable. And then in the 2018 budget, a few months after the report was published, the OBR in the accompanying forecast said, well, we've spoken to the Treasury, asked, should we put this in? And they told us, no, it's only an ambition, don't worry about it. So it affects the OBR forecast, because if more people are saving more, they're saving out of pre-tax income, and there's more tax relief there. And because the OBR also assumes that employers would by and large pass the cost of higher employer contributions onto employees through slower wage growth than employees might otherwise enjoy, and therefore there's less income tax on that salary, less national insurance. So the Treasury, I think it was no surprise at all to me that this wasn't in the budget, because the background to this budget was the Chancellor didn't have much headroom. He was desperately scrambling around for ways to cut taxes. Is he really going to allocate any of his headroom to the automatic enrolment changes? Well, I was surprised, and given how successful the Treasury was in the past, slowing down AE, this was perhaps a bit naive. I did kind of expect this to be announced in the autumn statement, and part of the reason, I thought the Treasury seemed to be on board with it, because all of the illustrations about how much difference the Mansion House changes would make included the idea of people being enrolled from 18 and so on. DWP had scheduled their kind of annual statistical release on automatic enrolment for the day of the autumn statement, as I was to provide some context. And interestingly, the Pot for Life consultation paper that came out with the autumn statement had a line in it, which they quickly amended when this was pointed out, but had a line in it saying, we are consulting on the implementation of these automatic enrolment changes. So I wonder, and I've got no evidence of this at all, but I half wonder whether DWP was expecting it to be in there, and Treasury took it out at the last minute, which certainly, in the past have been last minute changes about slowing down the rollout.
Yeah, we had a pensions minister talking about this up in Scotland when they had an investment conference at the PLSA, and his comment was, we will introduce these changes when they are viable. Viable was clearly a word which had been put into his speech by somebody else, because as he said it, you could see he was thinking, what in heaven's name does that mean? Any thoughts about what viability means in terms of these contribution changes? They are obviously quite important to the pensions industry, and of course more important to members.
I think it comes down to being politically and economically viable, given the government's other priorities. And I think any fiscal event, the Treasury is going to look at it and say, if we do this, the OBR is going to say it's going to cost you this much in tax revenue. And also, by the way, depressed wage growth. And I thought, I mean, maybe it's not coming in, it couldn't come in until April 2025 at the very earliest for starting a transitional implementation anyway. Now that's the other side of the election, but I think they certainly didn't want to suppress pay growth going into an election. But I think that's the calculation will be made, and I just wonder whether DWP's maximum leverage was kind of in the summer when the Chancellor was announcing all of the Mansion House stuff. Bits of it required DWP cooperation, and it's quite hard. Yeah, it's quite hard to nail the Chancellor down for commitment outside of fiscal events. But just whether that was their moment of maximum leverage, and maybe they thought they got the Treasury tied down and they hadn't, or maybe they missed the opportunity. So I think the consultation could happen at any point, but I think the lesson from going back to 2002 is that these things can be slowed down again and again and again, and I expect that to continue.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, and as you can see, I am once again itinerant as I move from room to room at the National Liberal Club, trying to find Lebensraum, as they would say in Germany. Have you, dear audience, got any questions for David? Either stick your hands up or just take yourself off mute and ask.
We've got quite a few comments in the chat, Henry. Peter,
do you want to manage that?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, Peter, do you want to talk about your statement regarding Ian Duncan Smith and National Insurance? Let's start there. I know we've done National Insurance, but is there any sort of loose ends there that you want to talk about?
No, not really. I just sort of recall that I think it was probably in the early noughties that Ian Duncan Smith stated that he thought it'd be a good idea that National Insurance was consolidated into income tax, and perhaps got the benefit of the higher threshold for payments. And that was just an observation, really.
But that's, David, that's not going to happen.
Well, I think, the Office of Tax Simplification produced a report a few years ago on close alignment of NI and income tax, and it ran to 177 pages, and it was very, very, very complicated. And you have all these differences about weekly periods versus annual periods. Whether you're aggregating across jobs or doing it on a per job basis, and the contributing conditions. So I think, I guess, the other big difficulty is employers' national insurance, where economists would expect that the incidence of employer NI, so who ultimately pays the cost, is employees. You get paid a lower wage than you would do without employer NI, because your employer cares about the total cost of employing you. But it's, if you were to totally abolish NI, then you'd have to either have some kind of new payroll tax for employers, or you'd have to hope it would be a kind of transitional, everyone's pay increases overnight, and then you pay higher taxes to claw it back.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I was recalling, but thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. There's a few other comments in the chat again. Chris, you've raised a few points. Chris, do you want to unmute Chris Giles and say what you meant regarding about the AE costs? Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, I think generally I know there's been a lot of focus, and I understand it from a compounding interest, obviously, point of view, that the sooner you contribute and the more you contribute, the more you have at the end of the day. But I think you have to recognise that lots of people in their 20s, they are financially very stretched. I made the comment about 50% of them probably have a student loan on which they're having to find 9% contribution. So that's like a third income tax. Generally speaking, I think the self-employed is also another area. A lot of people in their 20s self-employed, they obviously have no employer. The LISA is probably the first port of call for those people, and arguably also for some where their employer is not keen to match any increased contributions.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, Bryn, you've put a quote in there regarding the government itself doesn't want to load the extra cost. Bryn, have you got any thoughts on this particular point? And then we'll go back to David.
Is this? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
All right, great. Okay, I'm sitting here. Oh no, I've got some weird background. Apologies. Yeah, it's just that the government would have a substantial cost if they introduce. There's a lot of low-paid young public service workers, and the government would have to pay its share of the contributions. And I'm sure the figure appears when they start preparing the budget, and they think, oh, we don't need to do that, and so they forget about it.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
not they found.
Yeah. I mean, before we go back to David, Bryn, what's your view of the budget yourself, as House of Lords and all that sort of thing? Are you a pro or against the budget, or have you got the budget blues?
Yeah, we're always against it. We've got a debate next Monday, but I've only really thought about the sort of public sector level of expenditure. The nonsense fiscal rule, it's really stupid, and everyone knows it's stupid. I'm sure the government knows it's stupid, but they're stuck with it. And there's this whole Mansion House thing, which the government keep talking about. It's not clear how it's going to be actioned. They're sort of stating these general objectives. We've got the new regulations for the new guidance from the regulator that we're going to debate next week as well. I mean, I've been sort of focusing on other things, to be honest. It's on my agenda for doing a bit more work this week. Part of the reason I joined the meeting was so I could listen to David. Apologies for coming late, and I'm going to have to go.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. That's fine. Okay. David, I'll give you a chance to respond, and then hopefully we'll go to Will Aitken as well regarding his sort of chat question. But David, your initial thoughts about that point that Bryn was making?
Yeah, well, I think I mean maybe before just go back to the point that I think Chris made about minimum wage increases. I mean, I think it's quite with freezing the earnings threshold at 10,000 since 2014 now. It's a period when we've had quite high inflation, but we've also had minimum wages going up by more than inflation, significantly more than inflation. And I think I worked out that in 2014, you'd have someone on the minimum wage would have had to have been working 30 hours a week to be eligible for automatic enrolment, and as of April 2024, that's going to be down to about 17 hours. So there's already been a change of sucking more kind of part-time, low-paid people into automatic enrolment. I guess on Bryn's point, I mean, I think firstly Bryn's point about automatic enrolment. I think there's a wider point about DWP's impact assessment when the private members bill went through Parliament. It was very odd to me in terms of the assumptions it made. It firstly seemed to assume kind of no knock-on effect on the alternative policy tests for employers who already pay from the first pound, which I don't think is right. But it also assumed that employers would by and large just swallow the costs. I mean, not 100%, but would kind of absorb them into overheads, or in some cases accept lower profits rather than passing them on to employees, and you get a bigger revenue effect if you make the ABR's alternative assumption. And I guess Bryn's other point about the whole Mansion House agenda. I think one thing that's interesting, with him being a Labour peer, is to me it's a little bit surprising that Labour's reaction to all of focus more on returns and less about charges, get money into private equity agenda has been, yeah, we're up for that as well. Yeah, you could see a Labour Party in an alternative universe making an argument that this is just about trying to help out your private equity mates at the expense of pension savers. I think it's quite interesting they haven't made that argument, and that they seem to be on board with that part of the government's agenda. Anyway, I went talk for longer, so I want to give Will time to
no, that's fine. Yeah, Will, do you want to unmute and talk about poor performance? That'd be that's an interesting question, I think, based on what we've seen.
Thank you. Yeah, just a question around the idea that consistently poor performers would be required to close or soft close to new business. What do we think, what sort of behaviour that might drive? But also, the way that the consultation was drafted, it seemed to me that it was intended to apply to master trusts and presumably GPPs as well. But conceptually, I can't see why it wouldn't apply also to employer-sponsored schemes. Now, if the problem is that poor performing schemes that an employee didn't choose have to be addressed, then that could apply to a company's own scheme that's being run. So, what do we think the scope might be, and what do we think the impact might be?
I suspect my starting point is that the scope would be, so you've already got the requirement to disclose into these 8 broad asset classes, which extends to employers' own DC schemes, and currently you have a statutory guidance saying, it would be nice if you could provide a geographical breakdown, but you don't absolutely have to. So I think I would expect that to be toughened up so that becomes, you do have to provide a geographical breakdown, and that the FCA will do something similar for contract-based schemes. And in terms of a wider kind of performance agenda, I guess there's 2 things driving this. I mean, one is, once you have automatic enrolment and the government putting people into pension schemes by default, this is something that the government is doing to you, or the government is ordering your employer to do to you. The government is kind of in line for criticism if there's a problem with how your scheme is performing, and that is why the charge cap, I think, was always inevitable going back to 2015 or whenever that came in, and I think it's partly why this debate about performance is inevitable as well, although that is also driven by the government's desire to get money into particular asset classes.
And do we think it could lead to providers kind of herding and being more risk averse? Because if the price of upside, potential downside, and the consequence of downside is closure, clearly that would be something that people would want to avoid at all costs. So could we see that driving different and more herd-like investment approaches?
Yeah, I think that's plausible. I mean, I think you absolutely don't want to be bottom, and it's whether it seemed to me that what was announced on Saturday might be a bit on Saturday before the budget might be a bit transitional, in that you've got to compare yourself to whatever it is, 2 or 3 other schemes with assets over 10 billion. Well, is it going to end like that? I mean, can you just choose which schemes you compare yourself against? What parameters are set about that selection? Will there ultimately be a kind of league table, and those at the bottom get shut down? What time periods are you going to use? Do you make any allowance for mean reversion and the fear that you're shutting down those who've underperformed just as they're about to start overperforming? I think there was a lot of unanswered questions about how this will work, and depending on how it does work, I'm quite sure there will be some herding or other behaviour designed to make sure that you don't come bottom, or you don't end up on the wrong side of that line. But precisely how that works will depend on where the line's drawn.
Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting, that particular point. Gareth Morgan, I know you're on this call, and you're very knowledgeable on sort of government sort of limits and payments and benefits. Gareth, the budget for you, and especially looking at the sort of lower paid, low earners, is this a good thing for them, or I have read maybe it's a bad thing for them? What's your thoughts, Gareth? And would you also?
Certainly, I was going to say, certainly not a good thing for them. And maybe I'm more worried about some of the comments that were made following the budget, where the Prime Minister, for example, talked about continuing to cut taxes by putting more pressure on benefits, which really doesn't bode well if the Tories win the next election. But that's a big if, of course. I think there are a number of things that just felt ignored. There was no recognition at all within the budget of the fact that, you know, the whole of the past couple of years and effectively hyperinflation, particularly the kind of the lower paid, lower earnings element where inflation hits harder, had been recognised at all. The drive to kind of reward people for success when they're already, I suppose, in many cases rewarded adequately, or in some cases more than adequately for success, at the cost of the people who really, you know, struggle day to day to heat and eat. Really major thing. My comment about the NI kind of proposal, vague though it was really the fact that NI is not just the tax, which is what everybody's focused upon. It's also the way in which you determine entitlement to a lot of things. So things like state pension, the new state pension is based around an annual tick box exercise for 1/35 of your working life to get the full entitlement. If you have less than 10 years contributions, either paid or credited, you don't get anything. But it's also used in a lot of other areas, things like the New Style Employment and Support Allowance, New Style Job Seekers Allowance, those short-term illness and unemployment support things. You'd have to do a lot of work to find not just a replacement for the conditions that the NI conditions that are used to determine entitlement, but the overlapping issue. How do you handle people who are, you know, going to have been historically qualified by bits of NI and in future qualified by some other kind of method?
Yeah, some really good points there. David, what do you think? I mean, obviously, if you get rid of NI, I mean, again, you know, we've commented already on it, but it's a measure against other things. So it's perhaps more complicated than just switching it off, I guess. Do you agree?
Yeah. But I guess, you know, you already have people who earn above the lower earnings limit but below the primary threshold are getting NI qualifying years in respect of their employment without actually paying any employee NI. So the kind of the least disruptive way to do it might be just to set the rate to zero but keep that infrastructure in place. But I think Gareth's right. You know, you've got current qualifying conditions which are based on this kind of weekly basis. Income tax is annual. You have got separately a debate going on about, you know, I know the Institute of Fiscal Studies in their first state pension focus report from their ongoing pensions review, talking about basically sweeping away the qualifying conditions and having it kind of based on residence, which I don't know. I haven't seen any polling. My instinct would be this might not be popular. You know, just the idea, even if it's small numbers of people, whether it's kind of trustafarians or, you know, maybe kind of. But perhaps in some cases, people who make a lot of money and retire very early, you know, should they still be getting state pensions based on a full working history when they haven't had a full history of either working or doing other things which are considered socially useful, like raising children or caring for elderly relatives and so on. But yeah, I mean, I think it would feed into that debate, and of course it's a bit of the 35-year thing. It's a little bit of a nonsense anyway for those of us who are old enough to have significant accrual under the old system. I mean, it was a few years ago I last went onto the state pension forecast site, but I think at the time it was telling me I would max out my state pension by the time I was about 48 or 49, because I'd been largely contracted in and you know, had the years credited when I was you know, at sixth form college and whatever. And so for a lot of people, they're already in the position of, when they get into their 50s, paying national insurance for no extra state pension. Meanwhile, of course, you've got people who were formally contracted out, and you know, the further we go into the future, more of these will have retired, who are being able to buy state pension on quite generous terms, you know, through their ongoing employment in circumstances where if they'd been contracted in for their whole life, they'd have maxed out their state pension. And I guess that deal has just got a bit better now that employee NI is going down to 8%.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole new ball of wax and possibly another coffee morning, but you know, I do worry about the self-employed, to be fair. You know, whilst a lot of them will qualify for basic state, there is not a lot in addition. We all remember SERPs and, you know, contracting out via an APP1 and all that sort of stuff, and protected rights pots. But you know, sadly, some of the self-employed aren't going to get anywhere close on that. So anyway, there we go. Does anybody else want to raise a hand and ask a question? We are coming to a close. Greatly appreciate everybody's input, especially David Robbins from Willis Towers Watson. I think that was a fantastic session. So big sort of virtual clap and actual clap for David for fantastic comments and fantastic input. So really appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed, David. And hopefully the video of today will be up on the Pension Playpen site this afternoon if anybody would like to go back on any points. And thanks for all your virtual claps. As usual, we'd like to pray for peace in the East and peace in the Middle East. We hope you all have fantastic rest of the day. And hope the weather improves. It's pouring down here at the moment. But thanks for your support of Pension Playpen. Thanks to David Robbins, fantastic. Thanks to Henry as well. But obviously he's got another meeting. And yeah, really great session. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. And be safe and speak soon. Thanks very much indeed. Cheers, David. Thanks a lot.